afternoon, everyone. As Robert mentioned, I'm a partner in the Commercial Property Department in Holmes O'Malley Sexton, and I'm going to just, as a wrap-up, touch on some issues that we have come across the desks in recent weeks, both on the part of commercial landlords and tenants. So many commercial tenants will understandably be wondering what their options are pursuant to the commercial leases if they're unable to pay their rent. This is almost a certainty for most commercial tenants at this stage due to the closure of all but essential businesses. Likewise, landlords are wondering what their obligations are vis-a-vis commercial tenants that approach them for some sort of abatement or accommodation to be made. It really is imperative that commercial landlords confront the reality that we're currently facing, which is that many commercial tenants will be unable to pay their rent over coming months due to the almost complete cessation of their business function. I will touch on some of the traditional remedies that landlords would have in a few moments, but I suppose the key point to mention at this stage is that most commercial leases do not have an automatic rent suspension clause on the occurrence of a force majeure event. So certainly our experience to date is that really engagement and forbearance have been the approach that have been taken by most landlords and tenants. Now that's not to say all, but in terms of engagement, some of the options that parties have been looking at have been, for instance, a commercial rent deferment. So, for instance, the rent for Q2 and Q3 for 2020 would be spread out over the duration of the lease. Now, if the lease is of a longer duration, that might not be as practical. Likewise, a second option people are looking at is if there's a deferment of the rent for perhaps a 3-month period, that 3-month period is then being added on to the end of the lease. Again, more practical with a shorter term lease. Landlords are also looking to charge interest if there's a deferment to ensure they're in no worse a position. And parties are also taking this opportunity to, in some cases, renegotiate the terms, certain terms of their leases. So, for instance, if you have a lease with perhaps 12 or 15 years left to run, but the tenant does have a break option, which is coming up in 2 years' time, for instance, a landlord may consider it worthwhile to agree to some sort of deferment of rent in return for negotiating out that break clause. And by the same token, most tenants should be reviewing their leases to see if there are any break options that they could consider exercising in the short term to give them more options during the course of discussions with landlords. Another clause that parties are looking at are the rent review provisions. So in circumstances certainly where there's open market rent reviews, which would allow for an upwards and downwards rent review to take place at the next rent review, in light of the fact that in all reality rents are likely to go down, landlords again are looking favourably on some sort of abatement in return for fixing the rent for a period. The final option the parties are looking at, but it's not something that's open to a lot of landlords, is essentially a rent forgiveness, so a rent-free period. Now, obviously, landlords who themselves have a lender or a charge holder or bank in the background, that may not be practical. So for those landlords, again, it's key that they engage with the lender, their own financial institution, because clearly a landlord's not going to be able to reach any agreement with a tenant unless they themselves reach agreement with their financial institution, because clearly in most cases the rent is servicing their loan with their financial institution. From the lender's perspective, there's also little merit in a lender at the moment taking any action against a landlord, because in all reality they're not going to be in any better position than a landlord, for instance, in evicting a tenant or getting a new tenant in place in the short term, and if they do, it's most likely to be at a lower rent. I suppose the final couple of comments, if you are agreeing some sort of abatement or some sort of negotiation or variation to the terms of your lease, would be to really look for financial data to back that up. So clearly evidence from a tenant that they have in fact suffered a loss, reduction in their turnover, reduction in their business to support the position that they're currently putting forward. And secondly, would strongly recommend that if there is a variation or an amendment to the terms of the lease, that this is reduced to writing in a deed of variation or some sort of side letter. We need to ensure that its enforceability and to avoid a dispute at a later stage. because certainly these things will be looked at again. Just to touch on some of the other options that landlords have at law, obviously they can sue for non-payment of rent, they can petition to wind up a tenant, but really forfeiture is the one that comes to mind in the event of a dispute between landlords and tenants. So generally the forfeiture events are non-payment of rent, breach of a covenant such as a keep open covenant, which obviously would apply in more of a retail or shopping centre scenario, or a tenant insolvency event. I suppose a degree of caution would be recommended, certainly for any landlords at the moment that are considering serving a forfeiture notice or taking any other steps to effect forfeiture. First of all, as I mentioned, just from a practical perspective, how likely is that landlord how likely is it that that landlord will get another tenant in the short term? And if they are successful in doing that, it is most likely to be at a lower rent. Secondly, and the key point is, forfeiture is an equitable remedy. So there is a degree of judicial discretion. So in circumstances where a tenant is unable to pay rent, unable to stay open, and these are for circumstances and for reasons that are entirely outside of their control, such as a global health crisis, it is likely that court would find in favour of such a tenant. And the final point I suppose to make on forfeiture is something that has come up recently in an injunction in the High Court, is under the Emergency Measures in Public Interest Act, COVID-19 Act 2020. Now, from a tenancy perspective, really this was to introduce measures to ensure that termination notices and rent increases were not served during the emergency period in residential tenancies. The emergency period is defined for 3 months from 27th March 2020. But in the course of Dáil debates, a new subsection was added which provided that all proposed evictions in all tenancies in the state, including those not covered by the Act, are prohibited. Now, it doesn't appear from the commentary that it was ever really intended to capture general commercial tenancies, but it seems to have had that unintended consequence, and that is a fact that a commercial tenant in a Dublin property relied on in the High Court last week to secure an interim injunction against a landlord that they claimed were preventing them accessing their property. So, as I said, while not all landlords are taking the same approach, it really, from our perspective, forbearance and engagement are the order of the day, and that is certainly what's coming across our desk. And I think in all reality, a common sense, practical approach to issues that are arising is going to assist in helping viable businesses getting back to functioning insofar as is possible to their previous levels once the restrictions are lifted. So that's it for me on the commercial landlord and tenant side.